Let's go.
Welcome to the Soul Fam podcast, where we expand your personal universe. I'm Diana Marquetta, and in each episode, Soul Fam co-founder, co-creator Lexi Strummer-Solden and I interview the world's most rising and longtime experts in consciousness, spirituality, entertainment, healing, and science. From Earth's dimensions and dimensions way, way beyond. On the Soul Fam podcast, our frequencies are high and your heart chakras will open as these powerful voices of today share cutting-edge research, profound experiences, and valuable knowledge for your world in this out-of-this-world, thought-provoking, envelope-pushing interviews that could only take place right here on the Soul Fam podcast. Today on the Soul Fam podcast, we interview Fola Veritas. Fola is a shamanic practitioner, Reiki master, and a psychiatric nurse. But here's the real trip today. We talk about psychedelics, entities, compassionate depossession, and all sorts of things out of this world. So we hope you'll listen, and we appreciate your time.
We are so excited to have Fola, owner of Deep Mind Squared, with us today. Fola, we have seen each other on meditation Zooms a little bit here and there, and I've noticed that you teach Reiki, you offer coaching, plant medicine journeys, and shamanic healing. In addition, you're a psychiatric nurse. What were you always drawn to these healing modalities?
Yeah, great question. And I had my own kind of mental health journey and also experience with what came to know as like a spiritual emergence. And that was sort of what really led to like the bridging of both the kind of conventional psychiatric world, which I found myself in, and also the curiosity of altered states. Like I was someone who was very curious, how do we adjust our consciousness and access different states? Why do people use drugs or different substances to kind of bring that on? And so, it was a bit of my like personal journey and just seeing clients and talking with people and friends who were already exploring those kind of realms. So yeah, it's kind of where it's all bridged together. Mm-hmm.
We have all the questions for you. All the questions. Just some people, a lot of people are interested in conscious plant journeys without getting into too many specifics, because I know it depends on what sort, the client you're working with and what their goals are and is this something that can be done in conjunction with a shamanic healing, or how does that sort of fold into your practice?
Yeah, so I kind of label them as two different types of plant journeys. Like I do get a lot of folks who are curious about using psychedelics or different plants, whether it's like psilocybin, even if it's cannabis, to kind of further their own healing journey. And then there's like people who come and they're not really in a place to start using psychedelics. And so the term conscious plant journey was one kind of used. I think it's actually maybe in Oregon, or there was someone who started these conscious cannabis events, if you're familiar with that. And so the idea really is to connect with like the plant spirit. And I find for people who are maybe on like higher doses of medication, they have severe like mental health backgrounds that, where they maybe just can't go into an altered state and like lose control in like a larger dose mushroom journey or whatever. We connect with the plant And to me, that's kind of where the shamanic aspect is. It's like being in that altered state, accessing, I guess, like the spirit world in a way to receive the answers we need. And that's ultimately what these plants do. And I think the conscious plant journey, we can access it with just like a visualization, our intention, and receive the benefits of the plant. To like receive answers that we need. So that was kind of, it's like these two kind of streams, which I think ultimately that's also what's just happening in when someone is ingesting a plant. Because I know of folks who've taken like large doses of a plant and had nothing come up. No visual, like perceptual changes. They're like, I didn't even take anything. And then they get a little bit of disappointment. And then there's people who take like the smallest amount, like a mic, and it's like, whoa, mind blown, like so it makes me wonder, there must be a whole other component there. It's like, really, there's like an energetic aspect, which to me is like the shamanic work in like healing the ancestry, healing through this kind of inner knowing. So.
Yeah, I was going to say that even people, I was just thinking back to my own, teas and things, even when you're not really aware of the fact or you're not putting that much thought into it, when you drink a cup of kava tea at bedtime or you take valerian root to help you sleep, that is plant medicine and you are engaging with that. It's just something that, is sold as a supplement and we don't always think of, okay, I'm going into, I'm sort of aligning myself with this energy and maybe this is going to be the outcome. I will say I am not a cannabis user anymore. I was for some severe back pain. I think I had a back salve that was very, very good. And it was a very unique evening of me and that plant energy. And after that, I thought, I think I've learned all there is to learn here. I thank you so much. I think that no more for me. But I think that people think, oh, well, there's only cannabis or mushrooms or things like that. I mean, it seems like the plant world has a lot to offer.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with that. Like I'm just thinking in my cupboard right now, there's like African dream seed is one that I have, and I'm like, whoa, okay, that's a whole other level. It doesn't create the same perceptual changes like a mushroom might or whatever, but the depth of healing. So I love what you're saying. And I also like how you talked about, sometimes we have these kind of challenging experiences that maybe we don't really want to have. And instead of like fighting or pushing against it, like to have a bit of gratitude can be really like beneficial. Because I think no matter what the experience is, there's learning to be had from that. And it might take like overnight. It might take years,
So do the plants, in your opinion, carry a certain frequency or a certain sort of quantum energy that interacts with our physicality? And sort of from what you're saying from different clients is that our physicality probably carries a certain frequency or certain toleration for some things and not for others. So I'm curious if your opinion is that different plants, no matter what it is, I mean, it could be a violet that, was grown outside my window, or it might be, cannabis that's been highly farmed and highly processed for a different sort of result. So I'm curious what your point of view is on plant medicine in general, no matter what it is.
Yeah, I like that question, Diana. And that's a great point. Like, it doesn't matter the plant. And I'm sure we've all had where we feel certain pull to like a certain tree or like a certain flower or whatever. And I hear that quantum, like I do get the sense, there's certain people who just feel called to certain plant medicines to work with, even like it's like maybe they want to support folks going into those journeys. Or like there's certain ones that we each have a preference towards. Or also quantumly, like I think this is kind of where the ancestral piece comes in, or like where we've come from, like our consciousness, I guess is how I would define. Like for me, I feel a huge part is like ancestrally, there's certain plants that I've been like linked to, and I don't really understand why that is, but it's like my life path here to carry that out. And I think that's a part of it. Which could also tie into, say for you, for instance, just an example, I don't know if this is necessarily true, like you might have an affinity towards maybe more like ayahuasca versus psilocybin mushroom. Why would that be? Yeah, there could be like down to the DNA, your cells, things that we could see, things that we might not see, like on that kind of quantum level that might like attribute to why you might feel more of an, I don't want to use necessarily the word attachment, but, like a draw or magnetism towards that particular plant. And then I guess we could say there's so many other factors too. Like there's a whole other world. I think his name's Richard Tarnas. He does like a bunch of work on like archetypal astrology. And when I kind of first started getting into the interest of this, they talk about from like a planetary perspective, how does that impact people's mental health? And I also was always curious, how does that then impact someone's journey? So going in from that like level of like the microcosm, macrocosm, if the planets are in a certain way and your birth chart reads a certain way, how would your journey at that particular point in time be impacted by like the all? So that's kind of how I link all those pieces. I hope that answers that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect that you were mentioning about you sort of feel ancestrally drawn to certain things. And I'm curious what that is. What plants you're ancestrally drawn to, if you don't mind me asking.
Yeah, well, so like my ancestry is part Nigerian, Norwegian, and Scottish. So I've been on this journey to figure out what in my blood lineage is connected to psilocybin, because that's primarily the one that seems to be on my path at this point. And I honestly have no idea why, because it's not one that I'm like, yeah, mushrooms, you see people who are like, yeah, like take more. I'm like, I don't like that. I don't like that altered state. It's not one, but I also see the benefit. And so, but yet there's been like things unfolding in my life where I've been kind of connected to the power of the mushroom. I think for me, that ancestry is more like galactic, which there's like all these other weird theories around them coming from like space, or I don't really understand that part, like honestly, but that's kind of been the things that have shown up. Yeah, everyone's like,
works for us.
No, we're totally open to that. That could highly be the possibility.
We're galactic over here.
Okay.
Yeah, we're totally into that.
Awesome.
Go where you want to go.
Okay.
Here. So that's interesting. I'd actually not heard that, but I'm curious to know more about that.
Yeah, I can't 100% speak to that, but it might have been like Terence McKenna who shared a lot of that, like the ethnobotanist. Is that what he was? About like where did they come from? And if you've had like mushroom journeys, I know for myself, especially over time, like they've become much more galactic. They have this weird earth component and galactic component to them. And I know that's not the case for everyone, but it seems like for some folks who come, and those especially who identify as like, the galactic like star seed, which I don't like all these terms all the time, but anyway, it seems like it does open up something there. So this idea that these little like beings came to Earth and they have been able to build this like connection underground. Like that's, again, the quantum aspect, like they can connect with each other that we don't see. There is a connection happening under the earth, the way like they actually grow the fungi. But then also this way that they communicate from like a quantum sort of level. And then is that also opening up the conversation to these like galactic beings, wherever or whoever they might be? I know that can kind of be scary. For some people, I definitely don't think this needs to be the truth for all, but sometimes that kind of shows up. So what are they trying to teach us from that like ancestral healing, especially for people who feel disconnected, which happens lots for like starseed type folks, at least the ones that I would say that, yeah, again, some people just come, how you just kind of naturally get certain people, your client niche, quote unquote, like those are some of the folks that tend to show up in my world. And it's like, oh, because I kind of relate to that too. And that to me is part of the healing, the ancestral or like lineage piece, which doesn't always have to be blood lineage. There's almost like these two different aspects that can like occur again. Mm-hmm.
Right. So curiously with the clients, especially, they you're sort of talking about a certain segment that seems to be attracted to you. What are some of the things or issues, so to speak, that are trying to be resolved during your sessions? And then can you share with us sort of how that session works and kind of what the results are? And I'm sure it varies from client to client.
Yeah. So I guess I can preface that with the fact that majority of people that I see aren't using any plant medicine or psychedelics. Like they're maybe curious sometimes. They want to do integration of experiences. So that's the main way I operate here where I live, because like it's illegal for people technically to utilize like these substances. In another province next door, it's not so much. Like they've decriminalized a lot of that and it's pretty open. So there's ways people go about it. You can order like mushrooms online, and all that. So majority of people that come in, I would say they're like, oh, like I'm feeling, I feel stuck in a certain pattern. I'm feeling disconnected, or they're repeating certain life experiences. They want to connect more to like their ancestral lineage, and maybe they've been brought up in like our very like Western culture. They don't feel like that's something that applies to them. Or people who've had what, again, that spiritual emergence / spiritual emergency. So people who've like maybe been diagnosed with mental health issues like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. But there's a very high like spiritual component and a lot of synchronicities and like the things that they've been told within the healthcare system. We have like certain pathological like definitions to like explain a lot of it, like hallucinations or paranoid delusions and so forth. But like when they come, it's like, no, like they have this true belief that it's something else. And they've been waking up to a deeper understanding about themselves and about the world. So that's kind of like the mix of folks that come and see me. And then also with like the entity removal, which like that's a whole other conversation, I guess. But like, I kind of think that's a huge part too around like addictions and mental health. And not in every case, but for a lot of people, they're like, hey, like I think that I have something attached to me and I don't know what to do about it. Weird things are happening in my life. And so tying in a lot of the shamanic healing and another like practice that I do. But the main thing is just like giving people space to feel safe and heard, like non-judgmentally, which, having worked in mental health, that wasn't always the case. And I've been guilty of that too, before I had my own thing happen. And then people who want to safely learn kind of harm reduction ways to support psychedelic use, whether they're microdosing psilocybin, they're going to go into a larger dose journey. There was a period of time I was sitting with people, but that was when I took a bit of a break from my nursing. So, because that's like a huge thing for me is I can't like mix those two worlds. Just being really mindful. Unless it's like within like the healthcare system, which is I guess kind of backwards, but that's shifting. And that's kind of like things that I do.
Has your experience as a psychiatric nurse, could you kind of be specific about that and how were you a psychiatric nurse first and then you shifted, or I shouldn't say shifted because you're still practicing both, but did that encourage your interest, or did you find certain things weren't working and not your natural curiosity pointed you in this direction?
Yeah. So back quite a few years now, I was working with like a police and crisis team. So that was like a huge part of my role was like the crisis work. So we'd go out, see people in their homes, do assessments, and then determine like, oh, like, okay, yeah, you're not mentally well enough. Let's go to the hospital. Ideally, we'd keep people in their homes with the right supports. But at that time, like I'd had my daughter and then I was going through my own kind of searching and exploring. And I ended up meeting someone who like sparked this awakening. Like, I actually thought I had been drugged, like, which I wasn't. It was like, but on my way back home, I'm like driving and I was like, oh my gosh, like, I think someone just gave me acid. Like this guy like drugged me. Like what's happening? My perception was changing, like legit, like the way I was seeing things, and I'm having a panic attack. So I'm like, oh my God, what if I like start going into a full blown like psychedelic trip on the middle of the highway? Like that's strange. And so I get home and like my partner's like, you're fine, but I called my friend who's a nurse and she like took me to the doctor. So I'm like, I don't know what's going on. And the doctor's like, you're fine. Like what would they have drugged you with? And da, da, da. It was really quite embarrassing. But it was that encounter with this person who's very like spiritual that like woke me up. And I started having these bizarre experiences, and then I was still working at the time. I'm seeing clients in their home. And I think like once like someone's like, yeah, like the angels are talking to me, and usually I'd be like, oh, like that's cray cray. Like, no, I'm like the angels, like I hear them too sometimes. What's happening? And it just like started to change my mind. Like, what have I been doing in this work here? Like, really, I wouldn't say I was that judgmental. Like, I feel like I'm a pretty empathetic person and compassionate, caring, like compared to some other folks in psychiatry who've been there maybe and had different experiences. But it just really changed my perspective of how can I best support people. And at the time I was actually working on like a First Nation reserve. That's where like we were based. And so there was like this other kind of like spiritual, cultural aspect that I was starting to tap into. Like I think energetically, I didn't really recognize it at the time. But yeah, I started moving through my own spiritual emergence, trying to still maintain my like nursing practice and shift it to a way that was more like holistic. And so I just started learning more about like Stan Groff and the work he did with altered states and spiritual emergence. He's one that developed like holotropic breath work and did a lot with the psychedelic stuff back in the 60s, 70s with his wife. And it just really like developed into this thing of me. Like honestly, that's how I, like people I worked with who for over like the 10 years I was with that team, like they're just like, oh, like Fola, this call came in, like you would love it. Like, and they would give me people who had a much more like spiritual kind of based delusional sort of system or weird things happening because they just knew like, oh yeah, like that's Fola's thing. They like, I think most people within conventional psychiatry recognize that there's like a whole other world, but maybe people are just too scared to admit that like, yeah, entities can attach to you. Or your like ancestors can visit you in dreams or in visions or talk to you. And like that is a legit thing. So yeah, it was kind of interesting just to see it kind of shift because of my own lived experience, which I think is a huge piece for anyone as a healer or anyone in general, when we can share our stories and share our experience and see people and see them from like, not through our eyes, but like kind of relate in that way. And then it normalizes. And that's what leads to like more of that destigmatizing of mental health concerns and so forth. So that was a bit about like what kind of led to all of that. And then I just decided like, okay, I'm done. I started doing the Reiki more, the shamanic healing for my own like personal journey. And it turned into me holding space for others and teaching. And yeah, last year, I think with most people with COVID, it was just this like, what are you doing with your life? You got to make the changes that are right for you, And I was like, what am I doing? Like, this is like my pull. I need to follow this. Like, I'm going to die in the healthcare system if I don't like step out of it. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
The entity.
That answers that question.
Yeah, I mean, we have to hear about the entities because I'm thinking like, well, gosh, how do we even start? I mean, I guess somebody might ask, well, what would be the symptoms of an attachment? Is it exhaustion? Is it being in a bad mood? What could that look like?
Oh yeah, I gotta be mindful here. Because I don't think there's like a set list, but when people call me and they're like, oh, because I'm interested in entity removal. And my first question is like, well, why do you think there's an entity? Because I have seen folks who it's like, they're just chasing for there to be something wrong with them. Like there has to be this thing attached to me. Someone needs to remove it. If it's removed, it's going to make everything better, but they're not really taking action in other areas of like their personal development or in their relationships or whatever. So I think really speaking with someone first before like using a list of what I might say could be beneficial. But otherwise, I would say it depends. Some folks, it's like they just know. They get this sense. They can recall an event or events where something did attach. Oftentimes people that come, it's like they were using a substance and then they notice it attach, or they were in like a very violent situation or something. Another one is like they notice weird things happening around them, especially with their space. Like if, even when I was learning about doing the removal, like I remember it was like a multiple day course, and like things in my house started going all berserk, like water just like turning on in the shower, items falling out of like closets, which like this stuff doesn't usually happen. But it was like, oh, like we're going to be removing some big entities in the class today. So things like that kind of happening. And then, yeah, I think like the physical wellness, like you're saying, Lexi, like, yeah, the tiredness, if there's a lot of physical issues that just seem to like, there's no answers for them, they won't go away, whether it's like stomach issues, GI stuff, headaches and migraines. And also like some of the mental health component. And that's kind of where, again, it's like being mindful. We don't want to just say like everyone with a mental health diagnosis. No, it's not that. It's just an entity, because I myself had a history of depression. Antidepressants helped me get out of that. I think there was a component of like the biochemical thing, because I just moved to like frickin' Saskatchewan, which if you know Saskatchewan, it's like cold winter. I lived in the desert before that. And so like my physiological well-being, it like shifted because of the temperament change. So like antidepressants helped, but then there was another component of like, what am I doing with my life, and like soul searching and feeling like I could be myself and all that. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. But in Brazil, and this is kind of where a lot of the learning had come, there's an organization in the States, Emma Bragdon and them, Integrative Mental Health for You. And that's where they do a lot of the spiritual emergence teaching. And they're highly connected with groups in Brazil, these spiritist hospitals or spiritist centers. And in Brazil, they've done a lot around bridging both psychiatry and like the conventional system with this spiritist aspect of sometimes people can have an attachment. And so addictions and different mental health diagnoses, they say oftentimes are these entities that have attached, or walk-ins or whatever it might be, that like the person's operating from that place and not really in control of themselves. So they do the work to clear it. So who's to say what it could be? I definitely think someone needs to listen to their intuition and just be mindful too, because there are a lot of people out there that will say, like I'm sure we've all seen it. Like when I was on Facebook in the past, I'd see in different groups like, oh yeah, I can help you remove that curse. And people will just take people's money, telling them they have like 100 entities attached, when again, it's like probably a much more simple fix than paying. So just be really, really cautious, whatever you're doing out there.
Not everyone does that either. I mean, I would say 99% of the really advanced spiritual practitioners that I know do not F around with entities. And they're like, nope, I will do a blessing. But if you need something cleared, like I can give you some recommendations, I'm not doing it. And so my kids are very, very intuitive and very into things. And, we'll joke around that they're going to summon something. I'm like, no, absolutely not. It is not within my skill set to deal with that. And we're not flying someone in. So no, you may not. And I think that if you have a daily practice like meditation or energy clearing or banishing ritual or something like that, that can be helpful, but not everybody has a daily clearing practice. I mean, is it something Diana and I have talked to a lot of people in this community about, I guess, energetic hygiene? Is that something that that you work with people on their own energetic hygiene?
Yeah. Another thing that's something we're all like you're saying, we all could practice more probably. I know for me too, some days I'll be like, oh yeah, I should probably do that like lesser banishing ritual. Totally. Or just like meditate and clear or check my energetic field, because we get busy. So like I'm definitely not beating anyone up or like beating ourselves up about it. But yeah, I find what happens is most people are not aware of their like energetic field, the fact that they are energy, that they're sensitive to energy, and that when they have interactions with certain people or places, that it's like they're open because they haven't consciously set like a boundary for themselves, that's impacting their mood, impacting their physical well-being, their spiritual well-being, and so forth. So yeah, there's certain like shamanic techniques and other things that I've just learned over the years. It kind of depends on where people are at, that I can teach. Some people it's like just completely new, and to other folks, they really love a lot of the different depth, and so certain like magical practices even could come in, because some people that's more where they kind of tend towards. And for other people, it's like as simple as just, okay, there's a bubble, or let's tie your fibers. Like, how can you create through your intention and visualization, the sense of protection around you? And what I've learned in the years, because I was for a period of time doing counseling and seeing more like adolescents too, actually. And like, to me, they're like the best population or demographic to work with, because they're so curious and willing to like still like utilize some of that stuff. I find with adults, they're a bit more like, no, like that's not my thing. And I feel like with adolescents, I don't know if they're much more vulnerable, but I think that maybe because, like the hormones, there's like a lot of like physiological things happening that can, even from like, I think they say like with like poltergeist, usually if like when a teen is going through puberty, that's when there's like, could be more kind of like poltergeist sort of activity in like a home, because of the things happening energetically within the youth. I haven't really read a whole lot about that, but that's just something I'd heard. So it makes me wonder, like these youth are kind of sometimes more open or susceptible to things. And if they're not being taught ways to figure out on their own, or like had the open conversation of like what's showing up in your dream time and how do you rewrite your dream? That's a huge one that I use, because I find a lot of youth have like nightmares. And what I learned in my practice within the shamanic world was that can drain energy. So going in, and any of us can utilize it, just rewriting the dream when we wake up. If it's like a nightmare, just simply rethinking what we'd like it to actually be, as silly as it might be, as crazy as it might be, like just do it. And that can help bring the energy back and reduce that like energy, like depletion. But yeah, there's different ways, I guess. But for me, it's just as simple as imagine there's like a bubble around you. You have fibers that leave your body and that can wrap around, and they can go through your auric field, teaching about the auric field and a bit about like how, we can perceive energy through others in different ways, whether we see it, hear it, feel it, know it. And then just allowing folks to play with that and come up with their own way of what works, because I think that's a huge thing. And the world I came from with psychiatry was like, you do this, that's going to solve your issue. But it's like, that's not how we are like as humans. So here's some things that work for me. Here's some things that like have worked for others. What works for you? Give it a try. What do you feel the most comfortable with? Mm-hmm.
Do you work with a lot of empaths as well? Because I find, especially with young people there, especially girls who are, a lot of things are happening hormonally, that they're unaware of how other people might affect them. I mean, they're aware of it, but they don't know why they feel this way. So I'm curious, and with young guys too, for that matter, their hormones are raging also. But I'm just curious if the empathic aspect of that is something you find to be pretty common.
Yeah, it is. And like there was something I was teaching before. It's like, I do believe strongly that anxiety is just energy sensitivity. So like someone who's an empath, who's an intuitive, they just aren't familiar with, like what's happening. Because again, we're not taught that stuff. So like, I don't know, both it sounds like you have kids, like it's like great, I think, for us as parents or around children, where if we have this like understanding, we can like, again, not imprint our beliefs and like indoctrinate, but hey, what about this whole other world where you might be picking up on people's stuff? And I personally think like the kids nowadays are like a whole other level. Like I'm still like amazed. Like there's like I just had a Reiki class and there's like an 18-year-old, 17-year-old, and I'm just like, wow, I wish when I was your age that I was anywhere even close to your level of understanding and connection with like source. And it's like, they don't even live, they live it in a way that's like just living it and being it. like they are it. They're not like trying to be it, which I feel like is kind of where sometimes I have to catch myself like, oh, it's like, it's just a role. It's like, no, just be it. So yeah, a lot of folks are so sensitive. They aren't aware, especially women, young girls. And I think they've been damned to not listen to their body for so long. And I catch myself with my kid, eat all your food, because that's what I heard. It's like, well, no, like, what if like she's listening to herself and she is full, like teaching her to listen to herself in that simple way. And then that's going to also echo into, oh, like those people, like I don't like being with them because they make my body feel like off. Then listen to your body. Don't be with them. Like
that aspect is true. And I'm sure other generations were sort of taught to shut all that down and not listen, as you say. I'm also curious if that, especially, and I don't even like to use these terms, but people who might be on the spectrum, that their level of sensitivity, because their level of intelligence is so high, and it may be that their level of consciousness is so high as well. And we just don't have we haven't really grappled with that yet as a society.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that because someone was just like, "What do you know about being on the spectrum, autism, and all?" And I'm like, honestly, I feel like I don't know that much, but it definitely that whole neurodivergent world is like showing up more and more. And I agree. I do think that's a whole other level of consciousness that we're not yet familiar with, like whatever that's going to be. And I recognize there's different levels to it and a lot of different learnings that like certain parents have to go through when maybe their child has like severe autism or, like is very quite reliant on or dependent on the care. But also acknowledging like our consciousness as humans is shifting. Because I feel too, I don't know if any of you have noticed this, but like I know more and more folks, like friends who are like, oh yeah, like I'm neurodivergent now. Like they're kind of like labeling self or being labeled with some of these terms. And it makes me kind of wonder like, oh, like what's that about? Like, I wonder, part of it to me is sometimes we just want to feel like we belong. But another part is like, I think we are kind of like waking up and normalizing the way we are. And like, however we each are, like what all these social constructs can go out the window, which happens often with those diagnoses, right? Like it's just being self, no matter what anyone else thinks or does. And there's something really freeing in that.
A friend of mine whose name is Oz, and Lionsgate actually is making a movie about him called The Unbreakable Boy. And we were all out to dinner, myself and his family. And we were in a well-known restaurant that was on a busy street. And a lot of people were walking up and down the street. And we were right next to the street at a sort of outdoor area. And people would actually come up to the table to talk to us from the street. And Oz would say, I feel so overwhelmed. And he'd shake and he'd feel so uncomfortable. And he's like, I just feel so overwhelmed. And I'm like, well, yeah, we all do, but we're not reacting to it, that we're not sharing how overwhelmed we all feel. We're just like trying to ignore it and kind of get on with our dinner. But he's so present. He feels everything. And then instead of, the rest of us are like ordering drinks and hanging out and ignoring things and asking the waiter to come over, and he's experiencing it all at once. So how could he not feel overwhelmed? And he's officially diagnosed as autistic, but I thought, well, he makes a lot more sense than the rest of us.
Yeah, what an interesting point. And like, I like that. Like, he's just so much more present, like, and be able to express that presence in some way. Like, what if what we're all doing is just complete distraction, which I think we are like completely like distracted. So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
So in your practice, you'd mentioned a depossession. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, like compassionate depossession is the modality.
What does that look like? Is it like, hey man, we know you've been enjoying your stay. However, you're going to need to check out. Is it sort of like that?
I like that. That's still, yeah, it's like a very, like we think depossession, it's like The Exorcist and spinning heads and like intensity. But yeah, it's a much more compassionate way of holding space for a being that might be like present with someone and giving them information. Oh, like just kind of like you would a kid. Like, did you realize that you're in a living human being? Like, oh, no, I didn't. Like, because then the person is kind of giving voice to the being at the time. And I liken it a lot to like internal family systems or parts therapy, where you're connecting to a part or a sensation in the body or a different part of aspect of your psychological well-being, and giving it a voice and asking it questions and receiving an answer. And so with this depossession, though, we, connect to something that might be causing a challenge for someone, and then have this dialogue with this being, and like pretty much try to like encourage it to move on. And it could take time. Sometimes they don't want to. Sometimes the person who's coming for a session doesn't want to let it go. And that's always a very interesting surprise. I had that happen when I did the training. Was like, there was something with me that I'd welcomed in when I was young after like a pretty traumatic event. And when it came to letting it go, I was like, I don't want it to go. Like, it's been with me this whole time. Who am I going to be without it? But yeah, it's much more gentle, compassionate, loving process. There's a bit of like energy work that happens too. And we guide this being to where it feels the most called to be. Sometimes the beings can be a bit more like harsh, but still it's not like fighting fire with fire necessarily, which maybe some people don't really agree with that. Which still can be very like direct and not allow space for something that's not going to be like caring or gentle. But for the most part, I find it's this like just reminding and awakening that being to like who it is. Cause I think we kind of can forget who we are, even, us as humans in our own roles. It's easy just to take on like, oh, I find myself in this environment, I must be this, not what I actually naturally was. So
what's your plan for your practice? What do you hope to sort of achieve with it? Or do you have a hope? Or are you just winging it?
I was just thinking about that.
Like the rest of us.
Hey, I'm like, what's my true north? I think I always talk about all these terms and getting clear. And sometimes I feel like I get clear and then I'm not so clear. And I'm just really learning to like just trust and like give it to God, like the spirit, like the divine will, like. And I think for me, it's really about supporting people in the ways that I feel I relate to the most and can do so in a, and that's just how I am. That's how my experience impacts how I show up in the world, what I know and have learned through all my years of study and experience. And that sometimes people might come onto the path with me and we have an interaction. And that's kind of that peer work where we like, there's something that's like shared and the person can create their choice. But ultimately it's just like kind of wake people up to like their own divinity, their own like truth and like self-expression, however that shows up. And there's certain things that I like to share about that. Again, I mentioned how sometimes I feel like I don't really know why I keep getting pulled into the psychedelic stuff. Like I've tried to like, no, like step away. I leave the thing I'm involved in. I leave. Then somehow it's like winging me back in. Oh my gosh. And so I feel like there's a reason like spirit keeps bringing me there. And I would like to do more of that work within like the healthcare system, but bring in what I know because right now with how a lot of the psychedelic spaces are, if you've seen like clinical studies, it's very much let people go into their process, blindfold music, people just sit there, watch them. And I think it's too clinical. It works for some folks because that's what's going to help them to feel safe. But I think, again, when we talk about the plant spirit, the energetic aspect, the ancestral stuff, there's something more that I think certain folks are much more in tuned to hold space for that. And I don't know if like you've heard maybe of stories, especially with like ayahuasca and some of these, like I used to work with Fireside Project, which is out down in the States, like the psychedelic peer support line, which is a really great resource if people are interested. They, we take calls, take text messages and support folks. And like often I would hear from people about like they were in psychedelic journeys and they felt like something attached to them. And not from the psychedelic, it was from like the guides, the people who were leading the journey that they're like, and who knows what's truth or not. Like it was definitely the person's experience. But I feel like there's ways we can like create these sort of like containers for these journeys that can be very, beneficial and powerful, intentional. And that's kind of part of the work I'd like to see myself bringing into the healthcare system, as they're already using ketamine a lot in different clinics and in the hospitals here. And they're going to start rolling out like psilocybin therapy. And I think that's something that could be a lot of use from where I come from. And then as a person of color, I think that's a huge other aspect, that like there's not a whole lot of people of color who are supporting or facilitating those journeys, at least here. And there's a lot of people in like these different marginalized groups, like First Nation folks and other like BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color groups, that I think could utilize the like safe space. And that's something I also learned, is like, oh, I didn't realize that like not being around other people of color in a journey would actually impact me. I didn't realize that until one time I was with some friends and I was like, oh, like this is bizarre. I didn't think it was a thing. But it is, and I think that's also part of our healing. Each of us have our own healing journey. Just like a woman going into a space with all men, right? Like it's like there'd be this disconnect sometimes, and it's like, oh, like what's that about? So being curious and being able to like offer these different opportunities.
Fola, you're so amazing. I mean, you're fantastic. We have so many questions. I think really quickly, if people are interested in maybe booking a healing session with you, or perhaps studying with you, or maybe women from the BIPOC community would like to know more about conscious journeying in a safe space, how can people get in touch with you? Are you on social media?
Ooh, yeah, I am on Instagram at this point, and YouTube. I like make videos. That's probably a nice place to check some of the things I do. Deep Mind Squared is the handle. And then, yeah, I have my website, deepmindsquared.com. That's probably the best place if people want to like contact me directly by email. There's a contact page. And yeah, we can just have a chat that way. But yeah, I appreciate this.
Do you do most of your work? Do you do most of your work by Zoom? Because we should mention that you're in Vancouver, correct?
In Alberta, actually. Yeah. Oh, I wish I was in Vancouver more.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I do virtual sessions as well. Yeah.
Right. So we won't let Alberta limit you, or I'm sure it's so beautiful
it is,
there.
Yeah. For the most part. Not Vancouver beautiful by the coast, let's be honest. It's nice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So let's repeat that. Deepmindsquared.com, is that right? And then your handle on Instagram is what?
I think it's deep_mind_squared. Yeah. And then on YouTube, Deep Mind Squared.
Fola, if you could go back, sorry to put you on the spot with this. If you could go back to, let's say, teenage Fola, I'm not sure when these sort of gifts started emerging from you, but for somebody who is maybe just starting their spiritual emergence/emergency, they might have gifts that they want to explore. It might be scary. Maybe it's just not something that's around them very much. If you could go back and tell young Fola, if you could give her some advice, if you could give her a pep talk, what might that look like or sound like?
Oh, I like this. Yeah, I would probably be grade 4 Fola when I got caught for doing witch magic fun things in a Catholic school.
So good.
Yeah. And I would probably just say, just be yourself. And there's a reason that all these knowings are showing up for you, like just out of nowhere, and being able to build community around that. Like just keep it up no matter what anyone in your house, your family, people around you, what people say about how like you're wrong or bad. Like you're not, like you have a gift and it's going to be used. And I think that's, just be yourself.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I'm sure our listeners do too.
Thank you so much, Fola.
Thank you both. This is awesome. Oh, I can't believe it's like already time.
I know. I mean, we could keep talking, but then the next tangent could be, Fola, tell us what it's like to be a psychopomp. And then that could be like another 45-minute rabbit hole. But Fola, on your website, you mentioned that you are a psychopomp? And for listeners who maybe aren't so familiar with that, what is sort of the role or archetype of a psychopomp in various cultures?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't know if I call myself that. That's interesting. Did you
I
show
think
me
I
where
called
I
you
found that?
I'm sorry. You know what? I just decided you were one. It
That's
didn't
okay.
say that on the website. That was just me.
That's okay. But that's a part of what we call like death walking. And that I think is also, and you're like, what? Like, and I think that's also related to the depossession work. There's certain folks who are maybe more attuned to holding space for others in the sense of that, like, even when we do the depossession work, like we're calling on psychopomp beings, like guides, to hold space and support folks with like that or the entities with that transition. And yeah, I know different cultures have different ways of identifying that. To me, that's like a part of the shamanic work too. But some people have that gift where they are visited by spirits who've passed and they go in and support them with transitioning or doing whatever other things might need to happen. I kind of think we all have that. Like, or we, in some capacity, we've maybe experienced it. Some people more than others. Maybe it's more, excuse me, for some people, it might be more like a loved one shows up after they pass away and it's only their family members that they have these sorts of interactions with. Whereas others, it's like they might do it for their entire community and not even know the people who are passing on. And they do it in their sleep, like in the dream time. They're doing it like consciously when they're awake in the wake time. It just varies. And then I wonder too how much of that is like bridging like the channeling. I don't know if mediumship is necessarily channeling, but some, in a way, I guess it could technically be. Though I guess with mediumship, I wouldn't identify myself as a medium, where I see some people, and they'll go and talk to their past ones. I do think that stuff exists, and I've seen it like where there's no way it could not be real, in my view. But I also acknowledge there's like some people who are not necessarily as real out there. But yeah, so for me, yeah, I don't know, like psychopomp, I just do things.
And so, yeah, I mean, that would be someone who goes between worlds. At least that's my very basic understanding. And when I think about a shamanic practitioner, I think about somebody being there with a client or, somebody while they go on this journey. So a guide or somebody safe, a facilitator. But it sounds like, and I didn't even think of this, I don't know how I didn't know this, that in addition to maybe the physical being practitioner who's with you, there are also maybe guides and energetic beings who are also on that journey with you between worlds. And that's just mind-blowing.
Yeah. We have like a whole team, I think each of us, to support us with whatever work we're doing or whatever we're creating, whether it's like your job's in writing and you can receive like downloads of information or inspiration, and that can add. But yeah, I guess I hear what you're saying. Then the psychopomp, the way I identify psychopomp is more like the death walking aspect. And then the shamanic work is definitely that going between worlds or spirit, kind of the things that are not so tangible and to the world that is much more tangible, and being able to bring information back and forth or support people in that space. And I guess that is something that I do, however that happens. So.
How many guides do you work with, Fola?
Well, I definitely have like ancestors that show up because they make themselves known. And then I like the archangels, like the major archangels, I would say. And then from the galactic side, like the Palladians are ones that show up often in sessions with certain folks. Some Egyptian deities like Sekhmet, I'd say, is another one. And then Merlin, which I guess is probably my the Scottish, Norwegian, that sort of aspect. So yeah, like there's a few different ones that have shown up, and whatever, like I think they're like these archetypes. They represent things, they show in different ways and reasons with different clients. And I always love how a certain one will come in And then when it's shared, the person's like, oh, like I had this with a client not long ago. Like we did something and we were doing this like healing, and then it was clear like Sekhmet's like coming in, and I was like, okay. And then I shared that. They're like, oh, like I work with Sekhmet all the time. And I was like, I didn't need, like that completely threw me off because it didn't, no judgments, but like I didn't get that from seeing the person. But it's like, wow, just like so powerful to see how like we're all kind of interconnected, and these beings are supporting us in so many different ways. And for me too, to like, I think for all of us to learn to trust our intuition or things that are showing up, and to like share what we're feeling called to share. Cause I think there can be a lot of power in that, and it supports everyone on their journey. But yeah, those are some of the ones, I guess, that the guys that I like. Then there's some that I'm like, why is it that you continually show up in my life? I wouldn't necessarily call them guides, but there's like connections with certain beings that I'm like, oh, like whatever that is, I guess it's just part of my journey. Like, it's interesting.
You're really inspiring, Fola, I have to say.
Fola, owner of Deep Mind Squared. And if you would like to reach out to Fola, you can contact her via deepmindsquared.com. Is that correct?
Yes. And thank you both. So much. Thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Soul Fam podcast. Be sure to tune in to every episode where we dive into a different rabbit hole of the known and unknown to empower you in conscious living and exploration of the greater universe. We hope you leave each episode with a little stardust in your hair and inspiration in your heart. With love from your Soul Fam.